Hello and welcome to another edition of Radio YesCymru on your favourite podcast apps and also on the YesCymru YouTube channel. I'm Siôn Jobbins and my guest tonight is Lesley Riddoch, all the way from Scotland.
Yes, although I am indeed sitting in Scotland,
You're
although
actually
I was
good.
before down at Rhyl, which was quite some
Yeah,
journey,
well,
but
this is
whatever.
where I saw you and a couple of people asked me, you need to get Lesley on the podcast. And I was at the Tail Larry, which I was glad to see because I was a little nervous about it. It's a week before the big by-election in Caerphilly, which played when, thankfully, and Rhyl is not a very nationalist area, but I thought it turned out, and it's October, not very clement weather, so it turned out it was good. And I was very impressed with your speech. So before we get kicking onto that, I'd just like people to understand about your background. Born in England, moved to Belfast, then to Glasgow, then you're the chair of the Oxford Students' Union. What went wrong, Lesley? You could have been a happy Brit, a part of the establishment. What happened to you? Why you ended up a rabid Scottish nationalist and internationalist?
It's weird, isn't it?
Independence.
Yes, I should have been a sort of Marks and Spencer shareholder that just sits watching BBC4 every night. I don't know what went wrong. My parents are kind of slightly what went wrong.
Right.
My dad came from a road junction in Banffshire in a council house. My mother came from a council house in Wick and Caithness. They were Highlanders. My mother's family were cleared back in the day. So they retained a strange combination of small c conservatism and rabid rage about land ownership, which they didn't seem to think was odd. It's pretty odd. We moved to Northern Ireland. Okay, that was a weird one because just when we basically got there, when I was 3, the place blew up, essentially. I was too young to understand what was going on at the time, but you fairly understood, the difficulty of having very divided communities and just kind of an inability to be taken seriously as people on the ground in Northern Ireland. I grew up as if you like, a posh prod. Anytime I meet someone from the province, they'll ask about your school and you say, look, shall we just cut to the chase, basically? And yet when I look back at everything there, it kind of probably gave me a lifetime horror of just the very bitter kind of divisions that can kick in when you don't treat people fairly and they don't have a square go in a democratic sense. So, yes, a lot of that was pretty formative.
I think it actually explains a lot about your activism. So you're very active in the independence movement. You're not a paid politician. You've done some excellent videos, which I'll give a link to in the bio, about small independent countries, and also a lot of stuff about land ownership and forestation, reforestation. And I think hearing your background so explains that. So seeing the social injustice, a strong sense of Scottish nationality, but without it being taken down to an antagonistic and violent path. And also, I think the land distribution and the ecology side is an important part of your makeup as well as your feminism. So I think the work you've done is very important, looking from the outside from Wales, in moving the agenda for, and also the kind of Scotland you want. And I think this is very important as we're coming, I think, closer to some kind of a dissolution of the UK. Things are, well, we have no idea what will happen. And I don't believe in teleology where things are incumbent to happen, but I think it will happen. So I think the kind of Scotland you're promoting gives people a lot of food for thought and something to fight for. So,
well, and the same with Wales. I mean, as I was saying in that speech, Estonia is, the world's, it's Europe's fastest growing digital tiger, if you like, the Baltic tiger. It only became independent in 1991. I think from memory, it's a third of the population of Wales. It has pretty much not much in the way of natural resources. It was a forgotten corner of the Soviet Empire. Their only fortune was, like you, they were able to teach in Estonian in their own language, and that kept them bound together. They had a singing revolution that people may have heard of. Again, very like you guys, you fairly sing. So there was a lot of, it was cultural capital that kept them alive through these long, horrible Soviet occupation years. And when they came out the other end, they decided they weren't going to have no truck with the past. So that meant all their old politicians went. They had the youngest cabinet in the world of 20 and 30-year-olds. I've just been re-editing it, and one of the guys says that he was a banker at the beginning, and the EU guys came to see them, and he was a teenager, a banker. Right.
Yeah.
So, now that everyone would go, good luck there, mate. But what that did mean was that when the diaspora came back, and that's what does happen when a country becomes independent, they had people who had, one guy in particular who became their president, had been very involved with MIT in the States, had begun to understand this new thing called the internet. And he basically said to a young cabinet of teenagers and 20-year-olds, what we need to do is invest everything we've got, and that was nothing, everything in a digital revolution. And they went, okay. Now, nowhere else in Europe had that confidence, that insight, or that ability to start from scratch. And that is what any of our countries could do. Scotland could do it, Wales could do it in principle, but unfortunately our brains have been somewhat messed with, and we're all old, So they had the happy, happenstance essentially of being forced onto their uppers because they had no advantages otherwise. And that's the kind of thinking that people need to start adopting when they begin to look at a future beyond the current UK.
Yeah, well, we need to, in Wales, can do Cymru. I mean, the Estonians also noticed because the infrastructure in terms of telecommunications was so bad under Soviet rule, they decided, okay, this is going out. We're not going to invest in that industry now. We're just going to leapfrog that into Wi-Fi and the internet. So they essentially decided what was a problem there, lack of telephones, although they had more than the other parts of the Soviet Union. They decided to ditch investing in that old technology and went with something new. And I think that's a very instructive lesson, I think, for all politicians and policy makers as well.
But I think essentially, I mean, my mother's lot particularly are probably Nordic originally. And so that got me interested quite early on, because all the comparisons that are made in Britain are with who England rates. And that's France, Germany, the big countries. They are not on a par with Scotland, which is about almost 6 million people, Wales, half that, less than half that. But we are kind of constant, and America we're constantly compared with, 312 million people. We're not the same place. And yet these small Nordic countries are actually the world's most successful democracies. They're the same size. Now, is nobody interested in seeing how things work as opposed to how they don't work? And if you want to know, you're going to have to dig, because nothing gets covered from these countries. It's as if it's just too seditious, too destabilizing, too mind-blowing to think that a bunch of people sitting at a latitude like Finland, where I've just come back from making a film, there's an amazing one. That country has got the world's best food security. Now just hold that thought. A third of it is in the Arctic. 70% of it is forest.
Yes, I've been there.
And for half of its year, all its ports are frozen solid. And it has the world's best food security, partly because it's run by cooperatives. So there's no guys from outside that are going to swing in and take your food. So all of this is worth knowing, and you just got to go and find it out yourself.
Well, I think Britishness is an ideology, isn't it? So you could have two brothers or siblings, and one is a Welsh or Scottish nationalist, the other one believes in the Union. So it's nothing to do with ethnicity, it's an ideology, the same as Thatcherism or communism or religion or whatever. And it captures people. And I remember, again, leading to the Scottish referendum, I was inspired with the Arc of Prosperity, which has been talked about. So the Nordic countries and Scotland could be part of that. Of course, the banking crash happened, and you could almost see Gordon Brown couldn't believe his luck, because he could then see these small countries now desperate. Of course, what Iceland does is jail its bankers and comes back bouncing, whereas Gordon Brown actually is part of the problem with the City of London, where he kept it deregulating. We're still paying the price now, almost 20 years of austerity caused partly by that.
There's some very important points in all of that. I actually went in to see Alex Salmond about a couple of months after he'd come out with his Arc of Prosperity business to see where it had, what he meant by it. And he was basically had just taken a lever from each of the three countries around us, which are independent, a lever which a devolved country couldn't use. And I said to him, well, I mean, that's fine. But I mean, taking one thing out of context, out of the whole economy, society, blah, 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 really? I said, do you not fancy kind of going? Have you visited them at all? And he'd been to Ireland, but he hadn't been to Norway or Iceland at that point. And I can remember sitting there saying to him, seriously, you need to get out more. And there was like, you could have heard a pin drop around the place because nobody spoke back to Alex at that point. He'd just been elected. And he sort of looked at me like, God, you've got a bit of a notion to yourself, and said, right, would you just sit there for a while? And he went off and did a couple of other meetings, came back, and we sat and had a 4-hour conversation about this.
Right.
And I said to him, do you know what you should have really called this is the arc of resilience? Because this quest for just prosperity is incredibly materialist. It appeals to a sort of get rich quick kind of mentality, which is actually incredibly British. And what is going for all of these other countries is that you can knock them sideways. They can be blindsided by the greed that the Icelanders discovered existed in their midst from a small group of people. You can have a really, terrible situation as Ireland had post-Brexit, where their whole economy could have crashed, and they come back. So to me, what you want to learn is the resilience that you actually probably already have instead of grasping over promises of material wealth. That will come, but the important thing is to start using and believing in your own resilience.
That's a very interesting and very profound point, because I don't know if you're aware, in Wales we have this saying, Yma o hyd, we're still here, we're still here, which is a song by Davies, one big nationalist campaigner and also business and entrepreneur man, which people tend to forget. And it's become huge since football fans have adopted it. So it's a very popular, so Yma o hyd, and it is about we're still here, we are resilient. I mean, I sometimes feel we need something more than just resilience, but I think it's something also which Adam Price published a few years now, probably about 10 years ago, the Flotilla Effect, just showing how small countries can be knocked about, but tend to get on the wave quicker and more agile because they're able to cooperate and bring this sort of sense of community together for the greater good of the country. Even if, obviously, as we saw in Ireland and in Iceland, people can be just as greedy and short-sighted in small countries as in large ones. But I think there is something there about, going to something deeper, that why do we want to create this profit and this money? Why is it for? And it is about retaining our nations and our cultures and what's unique and beautiful about us, and diversity of us. And also, that we need to sometimes put our heads together and put our egos aside and work for something better.
But there's a difference between being resilient as a devolved nation as we are, where if you try to do anything different, the Internal Market Act will swing in and you'll be told you can't do it. And being an independent country that can be resilient. I mean, the Icelanders discovered that the hard way during the Cod Wars, when, if anybody thought they could mess with the Icelanders and their fishing, which is 92% of their GDP, it's the reason that they don't want to be in the EU.
Yeah.
That's important to them. And by gum, they have no standing army. They never have done. They have no weapons. The only weapons they have in their museums are the bolts from that, that they used during the 1970s Cod War. So, that's there, the resilience to come up with ideas. I worry about Scotland, and I suspect Wales will be going a bit the same way, that we basically have a lot of the downsides of being smaller countries without the upside that the genuinely independent small countries have, because we're trying to reproduce bulky bureaucratic systems without even thinking about whether that's the best way to do it or not. And above all, without a confidence that people, where they are, can, generally speaking, run their own lives. So we're reproducing the top-down Britishness in Scotland in a big way. We have the largest so-called local government units in the world in Scotland. Everything is centralised in Edinburgh. That's true. No political party has tried to ship it out. And a lot of people might think that hasn't got anything to do with independence. To me, it has everything, because when I did a PhD comparing Norway and Scotland, and what was really striking there is that the Norwegians were basically modelling independence all their life for generations by being independent of Oslo. They ran everything themselves, so that once you'd got experience of that, and you were able to do it, and you just took it for granted that your town would be run by you with minimal interference from anywhere else. It was a bit of a slam dunk to just go the next bit and think, well, why don't we do this with our country as well? I mean, they had learned involvement. We're having learned passivity because, generally speaking, everything is run by someone you'll never meet. And I'm afraid the SNP is centralizing still instead of reversing that mechanism, which is it's just making it more difficult for us to feel resilient because who would know? We don't get a shot at anything, you know.
Yeah.
It'd be like you sort of wondering whether you're a crack shot at anything and you've never lifted. As I said, this is a very bad example. I've just come from a fairground yesterday. But you wouldn't know what capacity you've got because you've never even at a fairground lifted a gun. So it's kind of we've no idea what we're capable of.
I mean, there's 2 points there. I mean, an interesting discussion on Radio YesCymru with Mark Hooper, who points out that he's also applied candidate top of the list in Bro Morgannwg, just south of Cardiff. And he talks about the importance of ownership. Who owns the assets we have, the resources we have, and the need for those also to be decentralized. And we've had some discussions also with people about public ownership in terms of, and cooperatives in terms of energy production in a small village called Bethesda, just outside Bangor. So I think there's things we need to do. But what I'm hearing from you maybe is that needs to be baked into what hopefully will be a Plaid-led government in the Senedd, so that these aren't added on later on. We need to have this sort of decentralized power structure to begin with, and that you think creates strong communities where independence then is a natural part of it.
Well, color me old-fashioned here, right? But if basically Plaid or a government doesn't believe in its own people enough for them to run their own country, their own communities, let's just go home. Because what that's tending to do is create a very British thing, which is a belief that politics is the domain of a tiny number of elected people, just elected every 4 or 5 years, mind you, because you don't want to get carried away. That very small cohort of people, that is what is power, and that is what is politics.
So are you talking about, I feel like economic democracy here, which should be ownership of stuff? Are you talking about, I don't know, more referendums? How does it look? I mean,
no, this is really not that difficult. This is another of the ones where we just don't know how abnormal we've become. But every other country has very small councils. You have town councils, as I discovered when I went to Carnarvon, and they showed the Denmark film I'd made in the town hall there. But I'm meaning the normal size of a council that runs everything, hospitals, schools, the full 9 yards, is 10,000 people across the EU. That's the average size. Right, you do your maths. I know my maths in Scotland. Our average council is 172,000 people. We're way off beam here, right? So it's basically people haven't got enough experience, and experience is what creates confidence. There's some people have got, you spoke earlier about ideology. Yes, that's true. But I think an awful lot of those things you were talking about have just become habitual. People will not feel that they hold an ideology. They just turn the television on, see the newspapers, see all the defaults, and become British. It is a set of habits that nobody questions until we've come to a moment like this where none of it's working for anyone. And there's lots of people kicking up questions, but there's no kind of, reforms doing quite well because we don't seem to be able to get to the root of a lot of what's gone wrong with Britain. I don't hear, I was on Any Questions last week, I think it was on Radio 4, and, raised the dread Margaret Thatcher and said, really, an awful lot of the discussions we're having now about how to, fix services are utterly laughable when you've got assets like water in the hands of private companies who are, generally speaking, the publicly owned government companies from other countries who would never be mad enough to hand water to the private sector.
And same goes for wind farms and energy and public transport and everything. It's absolutely crazy stuff.
But once you've got those things in as unquestioned norms, and also, I don't know how Wales is placed, and Scotland has, happily has got public water in public hands still. But we're not subject to the Health and Social Care Act 2012 that set up private health boards of trusts. So the kind of idea of Virgin Healthcare running a health trust is mind-blowing. And yet, as I understand it, that's pretty par for the course in England. So here we trot in and start having really marginal, this is the boy sticking his finger in the dike kind of conversations about the wreckage of the public services that Thatcher has left behind her, with a party in the shape of Labour whose luminaries are unashamed to go on the record as saying they admire Thatcher.
Yeah.
And we can't have a conversation about what kind of country we could be because we can't even say that she created carnage.
Well, yeah, and sucked out billions of pounds from the UK economy, which has gone out to offshore funds or whatever. And that's the reason. That's your 2%, 3% every year you're losing, which adds up in the end to things not working basically. And we're now seeing we've seen the fruit of that for some years, and I think now it's just totally inescapable. So the ownership is such a big, important part of it, because I mean the danger here in Wales is we get independence of some sort, but the ownership is still retained by people who are living outside Wales, and we're in such a small country that could be hugely destabilizing if nothing else. And we've seen how Trump has even bullied the UK, which is a medium-sized country. And the danger that if we don't own these assets, then it'd be quite easy for an outside force or forces to destabilize us. So I think the ownership is so important, and our politicians need to be brave and ready to have the fight. And I would also say that we need to create a culture of protest to be ready to go on the streets to support them, and even to occupy buildings or whatever, in the way we did for the Welsh language, to make sure that we actually do control assets if it comes to that kind of crunch time.
Well, there's all of that, but I mean, since we've been a bit closer to this moment for a while. There's actually quite a lot of people who have experience of looking particularly at energy, which is the one that could make the biggest difference probably to both our countries, but certainly Scotland. There's very experienced, skilled people, experienced at renegotiating contracts.
Yeah.
And I mean, I've spoken to so many of them who see the Scottish government's kind of complete fear, really, of dealing in a commercial world, and despair, because their experience is that contracts are renegotiated all the time. So some of this, before we man and person the barricades, it's worth beginning to get the expertise that actually sits out there and start to get it into government. If Plaid win, I hope when Plaid win, I can see that from the template at the moment, it looks like it's very much following the Scottish example, where the SNP had 4 or 5 years of just showing that they could run the show before they went for, an independence referendum. And that's fine, but we did lose, right? So so I think there's a couple of things, which is people need to have confidence in themselves raised.
Right.
If independence is just a thing of how much confidence you have in some big cheese in Cardiff, will never become independent. Will never happen in Edinburgh. So people need to think, we could do this. We could do this, not that one single guy. And the next thing is we need to start being a bit clever about this and pulling people in who've not previously been in the political process to try to figure out strategies, particularly on this ownership thing. You've also got the awful business of Severn and Trent Water, is it?
Yes.
Horsing your water off.
Yeah.
That's one that's going to take some undoing, but people need to be sitting strategizing about this.
Yeah. And same, we have the same situation. We have Crown Estate, which is not devolved to us, as it's to you. All 22 local authorities in Wales have, at least the different parties have voted for devolving. The Welsh Senedd has. Of course, it means nothing because Labour Welsh MPs and the Westminster Uni Party don't want to devolve it. But I mean, we need to be, as I say, bring in people in who can do this kind of stuff. But I think we need to.
Well, it's a complete combination. I mean, with that one, I didn't realise till I went to Rhyl that actually you had been knocked back on the Crown Estate, because that seems utterly incomprehensible to me, because quite evidently it can be done with the Scots did it. So what's the problem, right? But if you make a fuss in Wales, that's not, you'd need to pretty much bring Westminster to a halt. So sometimes direct action is needed to get your issue up the agenda. If you're strategizing long term, there's some people who sort of know where the bodies are buried in terms of the ownership of assets. It might be quite useful to have a kind of, bit of a closed doors series of honest talks with politicians about what they could possibly begin to maneuver. But the water thing is outrageous. But nobody knows outside Wales. I mean, geez, desperate,
Yeah, and there's also is one of the topics where people in Wales, whatever their political affiliation, do feel, because it rains so much here, we do feel we are not getting a good deal. And Welsh water is in sort of funny situation where it's sort of meant to be nice and cuddly, but it's not delivering as well as it should. Partly because there's so much work to be done in terms of building up the system, but I mean we are being robbed as well of any way of making money from that. I think that's so. Your message for Plaid politicians and people in general is they need to be strategizing and being ready for a fight, and then how that works. That doesn't necessarily mean being on the streets. It could mean just talking to people, lobbying people. It could be get people in to be lawyers who can work through the legal side of things. But Plaid needs to be ready for that and not to go in naively and thinking, oh, we'll sort things out. And if I think there is a truism that people don't get elected just on competence. I think people just feel, well, yeah, of course, you're meant to make sure that the trains run on time. That's your job. So if it's nothing more than that, I don't think the public, unfairly, because that's quite a job as well in itself, thank you for that.
Yeah,
and you also create the agenda as well, I think, to win that agenda.
I mean, what Alex was some guy, and he was a tremendous strategist. Yeah. So actually what they did, and everyone could remember this in Scotland still, they took the tolls off the bridges. He renamed the Scottish executive, the Scottish government overnight. He just got some guys to go down and pull the sign off and put the new sign up, right? No argument, just did it. He abolished tuition fees and he abolished prescriptions.
Yeah.
Now, the SNP are still living off that hump, and that was 17 years ago. But, he came in and, boy, made quite a difference. So he didn't come in and just kind of show, hey, look, I can use the maneuver, I can use the levers, look, the car's going around in circles.
Yeah.
Everybody knew that something really quite ambitious was being done with government, where if he could push an issue, he would push it, So I think there's that model of dealing with stuff that Plaid might have to look at. People need to remember you were there.
Yeah.
And they need something really pretty big and bold.
Yes.
But I still think the problem that the SNP have got is that they are a very British party in that they believe power wielded from Edinburgh is the most effective. And in the end, nobody has really begun the big revolution, which is and that's the thing that all the Nordic countries have got in common. They are the most incredibly, power is dispersed right down to the grassroots of those societies. So it's maybe a long trip for us that way, but it's got to start somewhere.
Yeah. So I mean, I think Plaid have got one or two big policies. One is free tuition, free childcare for toddlers. Essentially, I think that would be absolutely game changing, and it's a very popular proposal, and I think it's so important. And there's some of the things in terms of childcare and also business, but they need to have these big ideas, as you say. And also, I hope they are strategizing towards independence as well. I mean, so Plaid said independence is not an agenda first term. I think that's what makes sense. But I think it doesn't make sense if they're not strategizing about how to build an independence movement to be prepared for a referendum or something.
Because, I mean, let's look at 2029, right? I mean, as things stand at the moment, there could be, well, nobody will tangle with reform. They could well be the largest party, but the Tories probably won't touch them a bargeful or they'll be dead. Labour won't touch them. Nobody will touch them. This happens to lots of right-wing parties across Europe, is that they are the largest or a large party, but they're ineffective because nobody will go into coalition with them. So that means that Plaid, the SNP, Labour, the Lib Dems, the Greens, and the Greens obviously, coming out as being pretty supportive of Plaid and the SNP, and your party, if they ever get their act together, and Sinn Féin, right? All these guys together may be the only chance of creating a government in 2029. Now, if that's the case, and Scotland doesn't use that to push for a second independence referendum, there will be harry-carry up here, I'll tell you.
Right.
And if that happens with us, what are you going to do?
Yeah, well, I think for Wales, the existential fear is that Scotland goes independent and we're sort of left with basically England, because devolution doesn't last more than 5-10 years if Scotland leaves.
But that's the point. 2029 is going to be a moment one way or t'other. And, you know, Clyde have got to be strategizing.
Yeah, exactly.
The possibility Scotland will go for another referendum and you will be left looking like plonkers if you aren't ready.
100%. And I do hope people implied are thinking about this. I mean, my little theory, Lesley, is that big political change comes in around 18-year cycles. And, you know, so we in Wales lost in 79, but we won in 97 of the devolution. We then had another small referendum in 2011 to consolidate the powers. And then I'm looking at, you know, 2014, 2016, so your referendum, Brexit. Something big is going to happen about 18 years after that. And I'm looking, sorry, 2032, 2030. I think there's some kind of generation change which will happen. And I think there will be another independence vote. I think you will win it if you do the work, but we need to be ready for that. And Plaid need to not be so timid to think that, you know, it's business as usual, because I think the UK is in a crisis. And I think people are searching for answers. We need to be that answer, not reform, of course.
Yep, agreed.
I mean, I'm interested in the international part of it, and this is something which struck me listening to your speech in Rhyl, which is also on the YesCymru YouTube channel. So have a look at that. And I do like the international aspect of it. I'm particularly interested in the Faroe Islands. I have a chapter about it in one of my books, Phenomenon of Welshness. And Iceland, there's a very good book by Gwynfor Evans in Welsh in about 1990, Pe bai Cymru yn Rhydd, which is a very small book about if Wales was free. And he compares Wales to Norway and Iceland and Estonia. And so I quite like this. And so I was struck, it seems to me, as looking from the outside, that there's this idea of Scotland being a Nordic nation. There's a Nordic council. I don't know if you want to be in that or not. We in Wales don't quite have that. We do. There's a lot of contact between, and certainly in the language, with the Basque Country, Brittany to a certain extent, Ireland, and the Gaelic community in Scotland. But we don't really have this idea of the Nordic thing. Is that actually being implemented in Scotland? I mean, again, is the Scottish government, is Scottish society trying to will that into existence more than just, you know, maybe a general idea of that? I mean, in Wales, we have a lot of local councils, town councils are twinned with towns in Brittany, so there's a lot of to and fro with that. A lot of education institutions do a lot of stuff with Basque Country to learn how in terms of the language policy and language revival. So there's quite an institutional weight to that. So how does it work in Scotland? Or is that on the agenda at all? Or is that something we should be thinking about?
Well, sure, blooming well hope so. I set up a group called Nordic Horizons in 2010. So that is 15 years of basically taking Nordic experts over, 6 a year, to speak in the Scottish Parliament. We've had 72 people over from all the Nordic countries on the basis that, you know, we had a devolved government. Perhaps we want to see how we can run it somewhat different than just doing a little bit better than England at stuff, which is basically all the kind of ambition that there seemed to be at the beginning. And actually, to be fair, Labour was also very interested in that, because a lot of their thinking around the social contract comes quite explicitly from Sweden. So at the beginning, all the political parties except the Tories were quite interested in whoever we bring over. As time went on, everyone fell away pretty much except the SNP. And then I've got to say they did too. They're all very interested in what you might learn from these countries, but there just doesn't seem to be the confidence to take a deep breath and actually enact any of it. Now, having said that, we have got, for example, the baby box, which was directly borrowed from Finland. Which is a great thing. There's a couple of projects like that that have been projects. God Almighty, come on! You know, we're past projects. Nicola Sturgeon went to the Arctic Circle conference in Reykjavik, which is held every year, which is a huge gathering of governments from across the world, actually.
Yeah.
And she totally blew everybody away. So she went for about 3 or 4 years on the trot, a big fish in a small Arctic pool, you might say.
Yeah.
So that was quite influential. So there's been constant talk about the Nordic countries. Myself, pretty much at the foot of a lot of it, it would have to be said. But I think it's because we are geographically close. We
Yeah.
are the same population.
Yeah.
We have, if any of us think we've got remoteness problems, I mean, come on, you've been to many of the places that are genuinely remote, and they don't think they're remote. The Faroese have got a brilliant map that has the whole world with the Faroes at the middle, which I just love. So to me, it's more like you become like the company you keep.
Yeah.
So, we obviously will always be part of British Isles, and we are super served with British thinking.
Yeah.
But if you want to keep your mind pretty corralled and unambitious, just keep doing that. What you need to be able to go, hang on a minute, why can't we be doing this? Is to see what passes for normal in places right beside you. So whether for you it's the Basques or the Irish or the Bretons or whoever it is, you've got to get outside the box to begin to see what passes for normal anywhere else, or you'll sink back and think that this is as good as it gets, and it's not.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's the definition of nationalism for me. Welsh nationalists, Scottish nationalists, is they do see their nations as part of an international community, whereas the British mindset, it does not really see that. And for me, the sort of the placing of Scotland as a Nordic or country is very, very powerful, because it just makes so much sense then. As you say, it's exactly the same populations basically as Norway, Denmark, Finland, bigger than Iceland, Faroe Islands, just a little smaller than Sweden. So there's just, you cannot argue then against independence when you see those kind of figures. I think Wales, we need to have a think about that. I mean, our geography is different, but I think what you've done in terms of linking with independent countries is so powerful, and we're discussing more with non-independent countries like the Basques, and we have lessons to learn from them. But I think we need to think as a movement, and it's not something we haven't done. So 1930s, 1940s, great self-taught economist DJ Davies wrote fantastic pamphlets with his Irish wife, French, I forget, North French, about Welsh economy. And because they both met in Denmark in the folk high school there, they got fantastic inspiration from especially Denmark in terms of economic policy and social policy. So we were doing this in the 1940s, but we somehow sort of lost that kind of international part of it.
But I think the thing is, people, I think most people's minds are story driven, right? And kind of most people don't sit with vast bunches of intellectual knowledge for the sake of it. So, for example, I made a film about Denmark, and we went to a folk high school, and they're even more remarkable efterskoler, where you go at 15 and spend a year at the courtesy of the state with other 15-year-olds and learn to become a responsible citizen. I mean, it's a game-changing difference in their education system. I've watched that Denmark film was on 43 times in Scotland last year. I was at every one of them for a Q&A, and I watched audiences a lot watching that. And people were actually almost crying, because, it was the thought that you would value your kids enough, and you'd be smart enough to realize that if you put the effort in then and change the school starting age, so we're not sending kids to school at 4 and 5, the earliest on the planet. If you start dealing with those kind of big issues, then you begin to inch your country closer to something where people have really got a chance. So I'm less interested, although I do have a PhD. I'm not a very finger-waggy abstract person. I tend to get where are people at with this?
Yeah.
I think that's why that Denmark film has been watched 2 million times online, which is astonishing. And it wasn't all
they've
me.
all got I mean, the recent one on the forest in Scotland's gone nearly 100,000. It's only been up a couple of days.
I know, it's weird, actually. But then that's another thing. You could spend a lot of time. I worked for the BBC for 25 years. Essentially, my career ended with the referendum.
Yeah.
And you could either spend a lot of time, with a petted lip getting upset about that, as many people do on my behalf. Or you could think, well, happy days. That meant I was forced out into discovering how you could make films yourself and put them on YouTube. So now instead of making films that are sitting potentially, if you ever got commissioned, which you wouldn't, but getting a film on at 11 o'clock at night with a viewing figure of 3,000 people, it's 100,000 people have seen that film about forests in 4 days.
Yeah, incredible. And the good stuff. So, I mean, there'd be a link to your YouTube page. Loads of interesting stuff there. And they're all not too long, Lesley, which is also very important. They're a decent size length. So, I mean, you can watch these stuff. Actually, I'm going to bring this conversation to an end in a minute. I was interested to hear you that you've been to Carnarvon, you're doing public screenings up in Scotland. I'm talking on your behalf now, Lindsay. I'm sure you'll be ready to come down to Wales, or if you can, to do something similar here. If people want to show a couple of films in an evening in Cardiff or Aberystwyth or something, would that be something you'd be interested in?
Well, I could do, but I mean, the only thing I've got to say is just, I mean, I'm just me, I'm not funded by anybody. So it can be, taking 3 or 4. I've just come back from an event in Brussels where I caught a cold, damaged my foot. It was great crack, but I spent a week recovering, and it's quite. So I'm absolutely not saying no. It's just it's difficult to be just drifting around the whole place for like 20 quid petrol. And that's basically how I've been operating up till now. So I've kind of probably got to think a little bit more about getting a little bit of kind of income back from doing these events.
Yeah, well, that's only fair. So that's something.
Scotland.
Sorry?
That generally happens in Scotland. It's strange, but actually cinemas, when you finally get to the point of talking to them, it's normal for them to just share the box office with whoever is the filmmaker.
Oh, okay.
No idea. So, that's a kind of model that works very well here.
Okay, that's something to keep in mind. Well, if people are listening, that's something to keep in mind, because I think the films are interesting, and then having a discussion at the end and how to move it forward, and not just go back home and say that's interesting and then have a cup of tea or something. Lesley Riddoch, I've been very glad to speak to you. I mean, I'm a big fan of your work for many years now, and I think it's so important to hear the different voices, and we need the same in Wales. So people are very active, actually doing stuff, moving the agenda forward, but not necessarily incumbent by any political party diktat or on just the feeling that they're betraying someone. So I think the work you're doing is so important. And I think my take out here is that we need to look at the power structure, ownership here in Wales, like in Scotland, the kind of international relationships we need to applied, hopefully led government is actively pursuing. So we have memorandum of understanding between Welsh government and the Basque and the Breton governments, but don't know how much they actually used. I think we need to be building on that and working with independent countries on their best practice.
I mean, I would think if you're going to have some memorandums of understanding, get Estonia and Iceland in there, because you're trying to get linked up with the guys who've made it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think we need to be ambitious, and I think we can have a big problem with parts of the civil service here who will institutionally against the whole idea.
Everybody's had problems with everything, Jesus. I mean, when you sort of look through all the places that have become independent, the poor old Estonians in 1991, right? They became independent. That and the next 2 winters were the coldest practically on record. They were sitting, and they had a situation where I spoke to pensioners when I made that film about Estonia, and they said, the old people said we were eating grass.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I mean, that's how bad it was. There was nothing on the supermarket shelves. Everybody must have been absolutely papping it because they decided uniquely of all the Baltic countries, they decided to go cold turkey, and they just ended all their contracts with Russia, and the rest of them didn't. And in the short term, the Estonians suffered and must have thought they'd made a terrible mistake because they had no new contracts with the West at that point. But actually, over the long run, and they're not kind of sitting rubbing their hands with this, but they look at their neighbours and the dependencies that still exist and realise that they went through a really tough time, but they had the social capital to work off that people believed they would get through. And that's all of this stuff needs to move forward.
Yeah. There's so many important messages there for hopefully applied-led government in the next Senedd and building the independence movement. And I think something's going to break around 2029, 2032, and we need to be ready for it here in Wales, because Scotland, I think, is going to be.
Humbly suggest you also, when I was at the thing in Brussels, I met a lovely lass from Ireland's Futures, and there's another set of people that are actively planning for a reunited Ireland.
Oh, right,
And they see that the South, the Republic, is not actively planning enough for what they think will happen soon. It's the same story in all our countries, that the independence parties or the change parties are not looking like they're getting involved in the issues enough, and civic society is stepping up. So you might think that's quite a good link to make, because I think if we can connect the Irish, the Welsh, and the Scots, we're laughing.
So what was the name of the movement in Scotland and Ireland again? Sorry.
Ireland's Future.
Right,
I'll send you the details.
We'll give a link to that. And I mean, anyway, YesCymru as a non-party political movement for independence is hopefully filling part of that gap and creating a mass movement, because it will be needed. It's needed now, but it will be needed certainly in the future as well. Lesley Riddoch, thanks for making the time to speak to me. You've been listening to me, Siôn Jobbins, on the Radio YesCymru podcast on your usual podcast apps. Please share the love, share to people, and also watch on the YesCymru YouTube channel. Until next time, pob hwyl.